Let's Wellness Girl chat about the interplay between motivation, discipline, the female brain, and our menstrual cycle. Welcome back to Wellness Fixes the Pod. I'm your host, Dr. Kelsey Vick, a board-certified orthopedic doctor of physical therapy and a pelvic floor physical therapist. And before we dive in, this is my first podcast that I'm actually recording after I've already said thank you on all social media platforms, but at the top of the podcast, I just want to say thank you so much to all of the new subscribers, new followers, people who have shared the podcast in some way. I am so grateful. It's one of those things where anytime I see the numbers just shoot up like they have over the past week or week and a half, I just want to thank every single one of you guys who supports and just benefits from the education that I'm putting out there and the behind the scenes effort that I'm putting in to try and make these podcasts entertaining, but also super useful and help you leave them feeling better about yourself, but also have more knowledge about your body as a woman and your brain as a woman. So I'm just so grateful, and I don't think words can really say how grateful I am. So just know that I am so thankful, and I hope you guys can feel that even through the audio, through the visuals, whatever it is that you're listening or watching on. I'm just very grateful. So thank you. If you would like to leave a review on Apple or Spotify or whatever platform you're listening on, I would greatly appreciate that too. But just thank you so much for supporting. It means the world to me. Now, back to motivation and discipline. We've touched on this topic before, and I think there's an interesting interplay between motivation, discipline, our brains, but then also our hormonal cycle. So we'll talk about all of that today and why you might feel more motivated during certain parts of your cycle and then have to rely on discipline during other parts of your cycle. When we think about motivation and discipline, what comes to mind? For me, motivation is the one I want. Motivation is like the exciting term. When I have motivation, it means I'm more creative. I picture it almost like this wave coming to me, picking me up and carrying me with the wave. It just comes to me. It's not something that I necessarily cultivate, except if I cultivate it based on action. A lot of the times, if I perform an action, I will be more motivated to perform the next action. So that's the only time it's relatively in my control. Other than that, it's sort of ebbs and flows. Sometimes it's based on a new creative idea that comes to me. Sometimes it's based, again, like I said, on actions, but it's almost always pleasant and it's something that I want to act upon. If I get motivation for an idea or a behavior or an action, it's something that I want to do and want to follow through with. So motivation breeds action for me, just like that wave carries me along. And if I'm thinking of the ocean or like a swimming pool or something where that wave just takes me and I ride along with it wherever it takes me. So I don't know what you guys think of with motivation, but that's what I think of when it comes to motivation. It does wax and wane throughout my cycle. So we'll talk about that later. And what really got me interested in this topic probably about a year ago when I started researching the interplay between some of our chemicals within our brain and then also our hormones as women. Discipline, on the other hand, it's something that I have to have. It's usually something that I have to do. Motivation is I want to, discipline is I have to. It's this strong word, but when it comes down to being disciplined, it's never that fun for me. I don't think of discipline as like motivation where it carries me on the wave. I think of it more as like after that wave's died down, now I have to swim. I have to put in that effort. That's discipline to me. It's usually not glamorous and it's usually based on something that I have to do rather than motivation, which is something I want to do. So what does neuroscience have to say about all of this? Let's start with motivation, or the want to part of the equation. Motivation is heavily linked to dopamine. And we've chatted about dopamine on this podcast before. If you want to sort of circle back, I think we've built our dopamine menus. So I'll try and link that link below where we get into the science of dopamine. But we can think of dopamine as a messenger. It's the messenger that is in charge of reward, motivation, pursuit. It helps us predict when good things might happen and it helps us to go after those. So dopamine is that messenger chemical involved in all of those things, but it is definitely the messenger chemical involved in motivation. It also helps with movement. I have to mention that as my little physical therapist heart, but we'll talk about the motivation reward side of dopamine today rather than the movement control side of dopamine. So the dopamine pathway for motivation. Dopamine is produced and released in response to a lot of different variables. I'm sure you guys have heard of a lot of them, but it's released in response to something good happening, an expectation or anticipation of a reward or accomplishing a certain task. It's released with music, with eating enjoyable foods, with exercise, trying new things, social connection, celebrating progress, gratitude. So many things produce and release dopamine, both internally in the states that we feel, but then also behaviorally, like exercise or eating a food that we really enjoy. So we'll get a little neuroscience-y, but dopamine's produced in the ventral tegmental area and travels to a different part of the brain to actually create that feeling of motivation and drive. So produced in one part, travels to the other part, and that area of the brain is in charge of helping to motivate and get us to actually pursue a goal. So from a women's health perspective, how do our hormones and the various phases and cycles of hormones throughout our body within our menstrual cycle actually affect our dopamine, our motivation, and our ability to pursue a goal? Estrogen acts as a dopamine amplifier. Estrogen increases production of dopamine. It reduces the breakdown of dopamine. It makes dopamine receptors more responsive, and it blocks dopamine reuptake. So in all ways, it amplifies dopamine. So as estrogen peaks within our menstrual cycle, we can expect our levels of motivation and drive to also peak. So I don't know if you guys track your cycle or are tuned in to when you feel more driven throughout your cycle or a little bit less driven and have to rely on discipline a little bit more. But I started probably noticing this cyclical pattern about a year and a half ago or so. And we've done an episode on it related to how to build your schedule around when you might feel more or less motivated throughout your cycle. But I thought it would be interesting to dive into the true hormonal physiology and neuroscience around it so that we are all more aware of when we should maybe lean in to motivation versus rely on discipline a little bit more. And I think it's truly one of those things, not necessarily cycle syncing your mindset or anything, but I think it allows us having this knowledge of what's going on within our bodies hormonally, neurologically, all of that helps us to give ourselves a little bit of grace and then to use those times in our cycle when we feel super motivated or we're willing to approach opportunities in order to go after something, but then also give ourselves a little bit of grace on the other side of it when we might feel a little less motivated, when we have to rely a little bit more on discipline. So let's start with motivation. But in our menstrual phase, so days 1 through 5-ish, that's this low hormone phase. So both progesterone and estrogen are relatively low. So estrogen and dopamine are both at their lowest. Again, estrogen's that dopamine amplifier. Tasks that might be rewarding typically feel like they require more effort, and you may need more external motivation during this phase. In the follicular phase, so days 1-ish through 14, but usually after that menstrual phase, so days 1 through 5. So this is on that mid to back half of that follicular phase. Estrogen starts low and rises throughout our follicular phase. So if estrogen amplifies dopamine, we expect dopamine and therefore our motivation levels to also increase steadily throughout that follicular phase, which is that days 1 through 14-ish. During the ovulation phase, that is our peak reward system activities. Imaging studies have also shown that our brains light up more in response to rewards during this phase. And then lastly, our luteal phase. As estrogen drops in our luteal phase, so do our levels of dopamine. We expect decreased motivation, requiring more effort to feel rewarded during this phase. So overall, in this luteal phase, we expect to be a little bit less driven and less enthusiastic overall about pursuit of any sort of goals. So that's the motivation side of the equation. Let's look a little bit into the discipline side of it, or the have to side of the equation. Discipline is a top-down approach. And anytime we talk about top-down or bottom-up, when we're talking about neuroscience, we really are talking about the central nervous system, primarily the brain's executive control over all of the different processes that happen below. So our brain being the top-down approach, our brain decides what actions we produce. A bottom-up approach, things like exercise can have that bottom-up approach for motivation, where exercise can increase our dopamine levels in the brain. So that behavior of exercise, that action of exercise can influence our brain, or that bottom-up approach. So we have a command center or CEO of our brain known as the prefrontal cortex. And if we're getting any sort of signals, whether behaviorally, whether neurologically, whether chemically, our prefrontal cortex can actually override some of those signals. So when our dopamine's low, our prefrontal cortex can actually override it and say, oh, I know you probably have low motivation right now, given your dopamine levels are a little bit lower, but we have to complete this task. That's where that top-down approach comes in. That's where the command center, the CEO, really has to step in and say, I know you might not feel motivated, but you have to be disciplined in order to accomplish this task. So the prefrontal cortex sends brain signals down the pathway to help regulate other brain regions to produce the action that we want, or really that it wants. Since what we want might differ from what our prefrontal cortex wants or knows that we want long term, but we might not want in the short term. So we can actually override our brain's impulses and signals when motivation is low. The discipline headquarters in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is just fancy terms for the location in the prefrontal cortex. So you can think of the prefrontal cortex as just that command center, that CEO, and there's a lot of different regions within that prefrontal cortex that are involved in discipline. All of these fancy terms make it sound more complex, but just think of it as the command center. So the discipline headquarters are in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and that's a specific area within that command center, that CEO, that structure that can help us override some other signals that we're getting. So the discipline headquarters have a few jobs. One of them involving working memory. So it allows us to hold our goals in mind when motivation is low. It allows us to switch strategies. So executive planning, if plan A is not working, it allows us to switch strategies to plan B. It offers inhibitory control. So stopping yourself from doing something you know you shouldn't be doing. And it creates structure. So it's involved in planning and organizing. So it helps to create that structure, especially when you don't feel like it. So another part of the prefrontal cortex, the ventromedial part, evaluates short-term pleasure versus long-term consequences. So this is where we might be a little bit more tired or just low motivation working on a certain project. This is the area that sort of evaluates, is this short-term want or desire going to help me reach my long-term goals? So it cues us to say, hey, that rest or that nap might not actually help you reach the goal that you have in mind of finishing this project and getting it back to school or your boss or whatever deadline you have set for yourself. So it evaluates that short-term pleasure versus that long-term goal you have for yourself. And lastly, when it comes to discipline, the brain has an alarm system, the anterior cingulate cortex, if you care about location or names of things, but it's basically the alarm system. And it sends an alarm when what you are driven or not driven to do, as determined by dopamine, is in conflict with what you should do as determined by your goals. So after that evaluation process, if there is this disconnect, this alarm system kicks in to say, hey, this is not going to help you reach those goals. Let's reevaluate the situation. So the alarm system sends signals back to the command center to say, we need you to step in here with a little bit of discipline. So let's talk about it in practice a little bit, just to get a more well-rounded picture of how discipline works within our cycle. So let's say you're in your luteal phase, dopamine is low. You're feeling low motivation, but you have a big project due. The anterior cingulate cortex senses this disconnect, so it's the alarm system. It alerts the CEO or the command center, the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex sends inhibitory signals to stop avoidance behaviors. So you're trying to avoid that project. This prefrontal cortex, the CEO, the command center, overrides that to inhibit some of those lazier things that we might want to do when we have lower dopamine and lower motivation. The prefrontal cortex also continues to keep the long-term goal recognition part of the brain online to remind you, like, hey, remember this goal you have for yourself or this goal that you want to accomplish. Remember that this current momentary want or desire that you have is short-term, where that is your long-term goal. And then lastly, the brain overrides low motivation and relies on discipline to accomplish the task. So from a women's health approach, estrogen also actually enhances discipline. It's not one or the other. There's a strong interplay between both. So the way estrogen also amplifies discipline is that it enhances working memory to hold long-term goals in mind. There's easier switching between plan A, B, and C, stronger inhibition to override low motivation, and there's increased prefrontal cortex control. So this is where the body, you're like, why couldn't it be a different way? Why can't estrogen help one and progesterone help the other? That's just not how it's built. And progesterone actually has a complex relationship with both motivation and discipline that we don't quite understand yet, which is why we're strictly talking about estrogen, but research is conflicting on progesterone's effects in each phase of our menstrual cycle when it comes to motivation and discipline. But estrogen has pretty strong effects with both dopamine and discipline, which is why we are looking at it through the lens of estrogen primarily. But during a high estrogen phase, not only do we have more motivation, but we also have more discipline when motivation is low. So motivation can wax and wane even in that high estrogen, high dopamine, high motivation phase. Like it can still wax and wane. And if it does tend to decrease during, let's say, that later part of the follicular phase when we expect high dopamine levels, high motivation, if you happen to drop in your dopamine levels, have a little lower motivation, estrogen can kick in to enhance discipline during this phase as well. So it does both. Discipline is especially important in the low estrogen phases when motivation is low. We have to override the pull of relative laziness with a top-down approach. Again, enacting that top-down approach, pressing that override button to override some of those lazier, low motivation habits that we might have in those lower estrogen, lower dopamine phases of our cycle. So how can we maximize both motivation and discipline throughout our menstrual cycles as women? In the high estrogen phase, the late follicular to ovulation to a little bit of early luteal, we can approach opportunities. We can create a structure to rely on later when motivation's low. Sometimes creating that good solid structure to be more disciplined with later on can really help. We can take on new, creative, and challenging projects, and when dopamine is high, let motivation lead, but also use discipline to narrow our focus, build habits, and prevent impulsive decisions. In those lower estrogen phases of our cycle, we can rely more heavily on discipline. Understand it might take more of that top-down effort. So if you're having trouble overcoming that barrier to start that task or to finish that task, just give yourself a little bit of grace, knowing that your brain is actually trying to work through that. We're trying to get that command center on board to override some of those impulses that we have to maybe be a little bit more lazy or lean into some of those desires that we want that might not help us reach those long-term goals. So it's a way to just give yourself a little bit of grace too by knowing how your brain's working and how your hormonal physiology is working as a woman. In those lower estrogen phases, you can also let discipline lead and use small strategies to increase motivation. So breaking up large goals into small attainable goals, that way when you accomplish a goal, you accomplish a task, that dopamine's going to elevate anyway. So that's that bottom-up approach. You're doing a behavior that is naturally going to elevate dopamine no matter if you're in that lower estrogen phase. You can also exercise, and you might have to lean more on extrinsic rewards or external rewards in order to feel more motivated during a certain task. In this lower estrogen phases, so again, that early follicular phase, that late luteal phase, you can focus on current routines rather than trying to build and maintain new ones. That's a follicular phase Kelsey thing to do. Build new routines, set goals, set reminders, really structure her day in the most efficient way possible. And then luteal phase Kelsey is like, oh my gosh, what was I thinking? There is no way I can complete all these tasks in the day. And that's okay. If you struggle with this, maybe try and stick to your current routines rather than creating new routines on top of that. You can use external rewards and structure more, and be patient with yourself because your brain's working a little bit differently. So a fun fact to end on, successful discipline actually increases dopamine. When your brain overrides low motivation to complete a challenging task, your brain releases dopamine as a reward for that effort. The cycle continues, making the next action that much easier to do because you have those elevated dopamine levels, a little bit more motivation to complete that next task. This is probably one of my favorite topics to research, so I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned a lot from it. I'd be happy to dive more into the science, but I like to try and position this education in the fun way and educational way, not like super in-depth neuroscience-y, just enough to where we can all understand our bodies a little bit better without getting into the weeds. But if you want to get into the weeds, I'd be more than happy to take us there. So you guys just let me know. I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and I'll see you guys again on the next episode of Wellness Fixes the Pod.